Hey, it's Daniel from Theology is for Everyone with more insights in Matthew. Matthew 25 is the second half of what we call the Olivet Discourse. In chapters 24 and 25, Jesus is responding to a question from the disciples at the beginning of chapter 24 that said, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And in chapter 24, I said that this cannot be referring to the church age, because number one, they didn't really know anything about that yet, so they weren't really asking about it. And all of the things that Jesus taught in chapter 24 were about the nation of Israel in relation to Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 about what's the coming day of the Lord, or the 70th week of Daniel. A lot of times it's called the Tribulation Period. Well, this continues in chapter 25. And Jesus tells a couple of parables. And again, a lot of times people look at these parables and try to link them to the church. But hopefully, if you've been following along with this series, you'll recognize right away that this can't possibly be. For instance, chapter 25, verse 1. At that time, which, by the way, refers to the exact same time that Jesus was already talking about in chapter 24, okay? At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like. Well, that should be the phrase that gives it away. The kingdom of heaven is not the church. The kingdom of heaven is the millennium, the 1,000-year reign, the messianic kingdom that Jesus will rule here on this earth, literally, physically, in Jerusalem, just like all of the prophets in the Old Testament said he would. That's the kingdom of heaven. It's been the kingdom of heaven all the way through the book of Matthew, and that doesn't change here. It's not about the church. And so we have this parable of the virgins. Five foolish virgins. They didn't have enough oil in their lamps to stay lit. So when the bridegroom came, he kicked them out. And again, I do not know you. The five wise virgins had enough, and they went in. Now, it's really interesting that when Luke tells this parable, he adds one tiny preposition that actually helps clarify. He said, when he wrote this down, he said that the bridegroom was coming from the wedding. From the wedding. Now that's very interesting, because in John 14 and in Revelation 19, the rapture of the church, or this gathering together when Jesus takes church age believers to be with him, is likened to a wedding, where the bridegroom comes to the bride's home, or the father of the bride's home, for instance, or whatever, collects his bride and takes her to his home. This is what Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. But if I go away, I will come again to receive you unto myself, so that where I am, you may be also." The context is his Father's home. And so the bridegroom went, collected the bride back to his home, or his father's home. They consummated their marriage, and then they came out to the guests and to the party and to basically the rest of their lives. And so the question is the parable of the 10 virgins, when the bridegroom, when Christ is coming for the wedding, for the bride, or is it when he's coming from the wedding with the bride? And according to Luke, this parable happens when he's coming from the wedding. This is after the 70th week of Daniel, a lot of times called the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation period. So this is not about the church again. And so it's about the nation of Israel, and some were watching, just like he had been telling them to all the way throughout the Gospel of Matthew, and some were not. Those are your foolish and wise virgins. The same thing in the parable of the talents, starting with verse 14, which, by the way, it's very interesting that verse 19, Jesus sort of gives a clue. He said that the master who went away after a long time came back. So there's not really a lot in the scripture that says how long Jesus is going to be away before he comes back for Israel. But here there's a clue it's going to be after a long time. And he rewards the servants who were watching, who were waiting, who were faithfully doing what he called them to do. Again, there are definitely some timeless truths. Should Christians be doing what he called us to do? Yes, absolutely. Should we be using the gifts and the talents and the abilities? And yes, absolutely. If we don't, will we be sent to an eternity away from him? No, absolutely not. And yet that is the destiny of this one servant at the end who did not do what the master said. Verse 30, throw that worthless slave into the outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is not the destiny, even of an unfaithful Christian or believer in Jesus Christ. This is not about the church. Finally, verses 31 through 46. I hear this a lot. Pastors, preachers, teachers, social justice, media people, all over the place use these verses. If you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. We must be doing social activity. We must be feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and dealing with helping the homeless and prison ministry and all that stuff. Should we do that? Okay, that's fine. I have no problem with that. Must we do that for salvation? Absolutely not. Is that the mission of the church? No, I don't think it is either. And we can't do that. We can't say that from this passage. Why not? Isn't that what Jesus said? Let's take a look at what he said. Verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Does that happen when he comes for the church? Is this about a judgment on the church? No, not at all. This is after the judgments on Israel and the unbelieving world during the 70th week of Daniel, the tribulation. And this is about the nations. Look at what he says. Verse 32, all the nations will be assembled before him. This is about judging the Gentile nations. When Jesus comes back in the second coming, he will judge the Gentile nations and he will judge the nation of Israel. That part's all over the Old Testament. He's going to separate people from one another, like into sheep and into goats. Now, this is very interesting. There are actually two judgments here. First is a separation, sheep and goats. This almost has to be the spiritual separation, those who are believing and those who don't believe. Then he grades them or judges them separately. And he tells the sheep, you did all of this stuff for me. You clothed me when I was naked. And they said, when did we see you that way? We've never seen you that way. We've never seen you hungry, naked, poor, in prison. And he said, when you did it unto the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. What does that mean? Well, these are Gentiles specifically that he's talking to, the nations. It's a Jewish term for Gentile nations. Who are the brothers of Jesus, the Messiah, the King of the Jews? He's talking about the Jewish people. A perfect literal understanding here. When you did it to these people, when? During the 70th week of Daniel, during the tribulation judgments and all of these things that are happening in the Revelation, when you, Gentiles, saw my people, my brothers, in this situation, you helped them, and in doing so, you did it unto me. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Flip it. Goats on the other side. You didn't feed me, you didn't clothe me, you didn't visit me in prison, you didn't do any of these things. They had the same question. When did we see this? He said, when you didn't do it to the least of these, my brothers, the Jewish people during that time period, you didn't do it for me. And so people will say, see, we're supposed to do all this stuff, the least of these, the poor, the sick, the homeless, because then we're doing it for Jesus. Again, we can do those things. That's fine. That's wonderful. And some people are just absolutely gifted and compassionate, and that's where their heart goes. No problem with that. But in order to apply this to the church, to us right now, we cannot skip Verse 46. The people who did not do this to the least of these, who did not feed the hungry, who did not clothe the naked, who did not visit them in prison, these will depart into eternal punishment. Verse 41, depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels. In order to apply this to the church, we have to say, if we don't do prison ministry, if we don't have a food pantry, if we don't have a clothing closet for people in need, we are in danger of hell. And that just does not fit any of the New Testament teaching, not Matthew, not anywhere else. This is not for the church. This is a very specific judgment on very specific people at a very specific time. When Jesus comes back at the end of the 7-year period of judgments, before he sets up his kingdom, who is coming into my kingdom? Who believes? Who follows me? And who does not? So chapters 24 and 25 are about a future time when Jesus is going to come back. The question was, chapter 24, what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus said, don't be looking for a lot of signs in the world right now. Here are certain things that will happen. They must happen. The abomination of desolation from Daniel 9. Lots of other things. But then there will be the Son of Man coming in the clouds. He will come, he will judge, he will sit on his throne, he will judge, and then he'll go into his kingdom. I hope this has been helpful. If you have questions about this, I know a lot of people do. If you have questions about this, maybe you disagree with me. That's okay. Maybe you agree. Maybe you say, wow, that's a new perspective I've never heard before. Can we talk about this a little bit more? Absolutely. You can put a comment down there, underneath this video. You can contact me through the website, theologyisforeveryone.com. Let's study the Bible together. In chapter 26, we'll go into the final days, final hours really, of Jesus' life before his crucifixion and resurrection. See you then.